Be honest with yourself. How many times have you been the one to text first, to make the call, to explain, even to humble yourself just to keep someone from walking away? You gave everything, your time, your kindness, your patience, even your forgiveness, knowing deep down they didn't deserve it. You hoped, you endured, you looked past things because you believed that love would eventually make them change. And yet, what did you receive in return? Silence, indifference, or worse, a cold stare from someone who assumed you'd always stay, no matter how poorly they treated you. Why does it happen like this? Why does loving deeply often lead to deeper wounds? Why does trying harder make them take you for granted even more? And why is it that only when you finally pull back, when you stop explaining, when you disappear without warning, that's when they finally start to notice you, miss you, even respect you? This isn't a rare story. The truth is, people rarely value what they don't have to work for, and they'll never truly see your worth if you don't know how to reclaim your energy. That's why, when you choose to walk away, not with noise, not with drama, not even with words, but with a calm, deliberate silence, you no longer look weak in their eyes. Instead, you become a void, and that void confuses them, unsettles them, even haunts them more than anything you could have said. In this video, we'll explore what really happens when you stop chasing, stop explaining, and stop letting others define your worth. When you choose separation not as revenge, but as a path to healing, you stop being their emotional reaction and start becoming a mirror that forces them to face themselves. This isn't a tactic to make anyone regret losing you. It's a journey to ensure you never regret losing yourself for someone who never appreciated your presence in the first place. If you've ever been in a relationship where you had to constantly earn your place, if you stayed silent out of love and only ended up broken and tired, then this video was made for you. They don't disrespect you because you're not worthy. They disrespect you because you never showed them you could disappear at any time. Starting now, you'll learn to hold on to your energy and offer your presence as a privilege, not an obligation. This journey won't be easy, but if you're strong enough to walk it in silence, you'll begin to see something change, because once you shift within yourself, the way others see you begins to shift too. We're often taught that if you're sincere enough, patient enough, and don't give up, then love will eventually be returned. Believing in that idea, you stayed when you should have left, explained when you should have stayed silent, and forgave even when your heart was already exhausted. You thought that if you just tried hard enough, the other person would understand, that if you loved deeply enough, they would change. But that was only an illusion, and it was that illusion that led you to give too much without even realizing what you were slowly losing in yourself. They didn't disrespect you because you were unworthy, but because you allowed them into your inner world without requiring them to earn their place. The more you reached out, the slower they responded. The more you explained, the colder they became. And the more you endured in silence, the further they pushed past boundaries you should have protected long ago. Not because you were weak, but because you loved too deeply and hoped for too long. But in doing so, you unknowingly trained them to expect your presence without effort. Because the more desperately you try to keep someone, the more you show them that your presence is guaranteed. And things that are guaranteed are rarely appreciated. The truth is, when you're too predictable, too available, too eager to please, you lower your own value in their eyes. You show up whenever they need, you fix every mess, you welcome them back every time they leave. And before you know it, you're no longer someone they desire, you've become an emotional convenience. In Stoic philosophy, this state is known as the loss of inner worth, when your need to be loved makes you lower your own standards for how you should be treated. You stop holding the dignity that others are forced to respect. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Never let yourself become something cheap in the eyes of another just because you fear losing your place in their life." The more you strive to be loved, the more you're pushed away from the place where love actually lives. And worse, when you're treated with less and less regard, you try even harder, hoping that someday they'll realize your worth. But people don't see the value in what's always in front of them. They only realize it when it's no longer there. That's why this paradox always plays out. They only begin to respect you when you stop trying to be seen. Not because you suddenly became better, but because you're no longer easy to grasp. You become more reserved in your energy, harder to read in your silence, and more valuable when they're forced to face a void that used to be filled with your unconditional presence. So ask yourself again, why do they only appreciate you when you stop? Why do they only think of you when you go quiet? And why do they only try to hold on to you once you've already walked away? The answer is this: when you pull away, you remove the mirror they've been using to avoid looking at themselves. And that's when the panic begins, when the reflection disappears, and they have to confront what they've ignored all along. That's when respect begins to form. When you go silent, people might assume you're angry, playing mind games, or trying to create distance out of spite. What they don't understand is that the silence doesn't come from a place of pain anymore, it comes from clarity. You simply no longer want to remain where your presence is no longer valued. Emotional detachment isn't about shutting down your heart, it's the highest form of self-respect. It's not meant to create lack in the other person. It's meant to protect your own peace from being drained by the fear of loss. You don't pull away to break them, you pull away because you're exhausted from holding together a connection that's slowly breaking you. Maybe you once believed that patience would earn you appreciation, that if you just didn't give up, they'd come to understand your love. But in time, you realize not everyone knows how to cherish a genuine heart. Some people only wake up when your patience runs out, and your presence is no longer so easy to come by. Detachment comes only after everything else has failed, after all your efforts have gone unseen, after your words have lost meaning, and after you realize that staying one more day would mean betraying your own self-respect. In Stoic philosophy, detachment isn't avoidance, it's emotional discipline. The Stoic isn't cold, they simply refuse to let their soul be swayed by the chaotic emotions of others. They don't go quiet because there's nothing to say, but because they understand that some truths are only delivered through action. And withdrawal is the final action that speaks of self-worth louder than words ever could. Epictetus once taught, "No one can hurt you unless you allow it." And you've allowed it for far too long. You've allowed indifference to creep into days that should have been peaceful. You've allowed disrespect to continue as if you didn't deserve better. You've allowed yourself to keep giving without receiving in return just because you were afraid to let go. But eventually you come to understand letting go is not failure. It's the strongest thing you can do to protect yourself. You're not heartless for going silent, you're healing. You're not cruel for walking away, you're simply reclaiming your peace. Because if your presence was once overlooked, then your absence becomes the loudest statement you could ever make. Not to seek revenge, but to declare, I am enough, and I no longer need to prove it. You no longer crave late apologies or someone realizing your worth when it's already too late. You no longer want a love that stays out of fear instead of respect. What you need and what you deserve is peace. And peace only exists where you're no longer forcing yourself to survive in an unhealthy space. So detachment is not punishment. It's a rite of emotional maturity. It marks the moment you stop chasing validation from others and start giving it to yourself. At first, when you disappear, they don't panic. They're not afraid. They don't come looking. They simply dismiss it because they assume, just like every other time, you'll come back. They've grown used to you being the one who texts first, who fixes things, who apologizes even when you're not wrong. They believe this will pass. It always does. But as time goes by with no message, no reaction, no presence from you, their mind begins to notice something is different. There's no dramatic exit, no argument, just an eerie stillness that starts to disturb their sense of control. It's quiet, too quiet. And in that quiet, for the first time, they're left alone with their own thoughts. In the early days, they might joke about it. They might laugh with friends, call you too sensitive, or claim you're just being emotional to get attention. They may even post casually online, acting unaffected and in control. But what they don't realize is, you're not playing anymore. You're not reacting. And that silence begins to stir a quiet question inside them: is it really over this time? The fear doesn't hit them like a wave. It creeps in, slowly. Every time they check their phone and don't see your name. Every time they scroll through their feed and notice your absence. Every time they post a song, a memory, or a cryptic message hoping to draw you back, and you remain completely, utterly silent. That's when their ego starts to crack. Not because they've suddenly developed empathy, but because they no longer feel in control. They were used to you being the one who stayed, and when that no longer happens, they become unsteady. They start thinking about you not out of love, but out of a loss of control over something they assumed would always be there. They wonder what you're thinking, how you're feeling, whether you're angry, or worse, indifferent. And that uncertainty begins to haunt them. Psychologically, this is when uncertainty triggers a deep insecurity. When people can no longer read your emotions, they start to imagine the worst, and the imagination becomes the storm. The questions come rushing in. What are they thinking? Have they really let go? Are they actually doing better without me? Do I even matter anymore? And that's when the shift begins. They move from feeling in control to being completely destabilized. Because you're no longer there to reaffirm their value. You're not texting, not reacting, not reaching out, and in that absence, they begin to realize you're not who you used to be. You're no longer predictable. You didn't disappear to be missed. You left because you were too tired to stay. But what they feel isn't abandonment, it's something deeper, a shift in energy, a presence that's become awareness. And that awareness terrifies them. On the outside, they may still act indifferent, business as usual. Life goes on. But inside, they're watching you closely, quietly, obsessively. They reread your old messages, revisit things you once said, recall the way you looked at them, the kind words they used to shrug off. And the more they remember, the more they feel something missing. Not because you were extraordinary, but because you were once the mirror in which they saw the best version of themselves. And now that mirror is gone, and all that's left is the shadow they refuse to face. That's when they begin not just to miss you, but to respect you. Not because you got angry, not because you tried to teach them a lesson, but because you did nothing. You simply pulled away. You kept your silence. And in doing so, you showed them that you are no longer their default option. You are someone with boundaries, with self-worth, and with every right to disappear when your presence is no longer honored. When you were still speaking, they could argue. When you were still explaining, they could dismiss you. When you were still there, they could ignore you. But the moment you chose silence, not silence born from anger, but silence born from exhaustion, they began to feel something different. You were no longer available to be taken for granted. That silence at first felt like an empty space, but over time it became an echo chamber where every word you once said, every plea they brushed off, every truth you repeated started to finally register, not through argument, but through absence. When you stopped standing there explaining, they were forced to sit with everything they once refused to hear. When you stopped trying to be understood, they began to feel the pull to finally understand. And when you no longer reacted to the same old manipulations, they began to lose their grip. In psychology, this is called the Zeigarnik effect, the brain's tendency to obsess over things that feel unfinished. And because you walked away without a dramatic exit, without explanations, without any official closure, that lingering sense of incompleteness makes it impossible for them to mentally close the door, no matter how much they once convinced themselves that you didn't matter anymore. They begin to remember the things you said not with their ears, but through memory. They remember how tired you were, how you once begged for kindness, how you had withdrawn into silence many times before and still came back. So when you go quiet this time but never return, it rattles them to their core. In that moment, you're no longer the one waiting to be loved. You become a space they can't fill, not because you were flawless, but because you once served as the light that allowed them to avoid their own darkness. Now that the light is gone, they're forced to look at themselves. And that's what truly scares them. You no longer need to speak up to demand fairness, nor do you need to react to prove your worth, or push back to preserve your pride. You choose silence because you've realized that anything repeated too many times loses meaning. From that moment on, you are no longer the one who's always there to listen. You become the one who's no longer there to be ignored. Your silence is not just absence, it's a statement of value. People can keep ignoring complaints. They can act unaffected when you cry or plead. But no one can ignore the silence of someone who once gave everything without holding back. Because that silence is no longer a temporary reaction, it's the final choice made from awakening. And then, when you stop trying to be heard, they begin to hear you for the first time. Not with ears, but with the space you left behind. Not with logic, but with unease. Not because you created distance on purpose, but because you stopped filling a space they never truly appreciated. From that moment on, your silence is no longer empty, it becomes a lesson, a wordless one. And they, for the first time, are forced to learn how to understand you without you being there to explain. You once believed that if you were patient enough, forgiving enough, and sacrificed enough, they would eventually value you. You believed that the more you loved and endured, the more you would be acknowledged. And because of that belief, you accepted things you once swore you'd never tolerate. You swallowed tears. You went silent through heartbreak just to hold on to a relationship that was decaying day by day. But the more you endured, the more they took. The more you stayed silent, the more they saw it as normal. And the more you held on, the more they believed you'd never let go. Because the truth is, people don't respect what comes from silent suffering. They don't see the strength in your silence meant to preserve peace. They only see weakness. They don't value your kindness because you gave too much without ever asking for anything in return. And that is exactly why they only began to respect you when you finally said, enough. Because true respect never comes from silent endurance. It comes from the moment you set clear limits. Not because you're harsh, but because you're no longer willing to sacrifice your peace for a one-sided relationship. The Stoics understood this deeply. They never allowed their compassion to become voluntary chains. They set boundaries not out of hatred, but out of deep respect for their own dignity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Set a value on yourself, and do not allow yourself to be bought at too low a price." When you begin to define what is acceptable and what is not, you create an energetic boundary that others can no longer cross so easily. Not because you've turned cold, but because you're no longer willing to waste your emotional energy on what is undeserving. And that is when their view of you starts to shift. You're no longer seen as someone easy to control, easy to win back, easy to reach whenever they feel like it. Instead, they begin to hesitate. They begin to think twice before they speak. They grow cautious with their words because you're no longer the one who forgives simply because you have a kind heart. Respect, then, is not something you beg for or demand. It arrives only when others realize that if they don't adjust their behavior, they will lose you, not because you're angry, but because you've grown. You didn't walk away to make them fear losing you. You walked away because you didn't want to lose yourself. And that act, quiet, clear, and powerful, forces them to ask the questions they never dared to ask before. Did I go too far? Have I lost something I'll never get back? So never confuse endurance with strength. True strength isn't in how long you stay, but in knowing when to walk away with your dignity intact. You don't need to scream to prove anything. You just need to stay rooted in your boundaries and hold on to your self-respect. And when you do, they'll begin to see you in a way they never did before. As someone they can no longer reach so easily. And someone they'll never take lightly again. There's a hard truth that not everyone is willing to accept. The more you crave respect, the easier it becomes for others to dismiss you. Not because you're unworthy, but because your desire for validation makes you behave in ways that quietly betray your own value. You hold on when you should let go. You wait when you should walk away. You bend yourself to fit them, sacrificing your own boundaries because you think doing so will make them appreciate you more. But the more you endure in silence, the more you're seen as weak. The more you suppress your needs, the more you lose the strength and dignity that once defined you. And eventually you realize every effort to be recognized becomes meaningless if it requires you to sacrifice your self-respect. It's only when you stop, when you no longer wait, no longer please, and no longer seek respect from those who have no intention of giving it sincerely, that you begin to become unpredictable, grounded, and powerfully self-contained. Not because you've changed to prove a point, but because you've returned to your own center, reclaiming your worth without needing anyone else's confirmation. From that moment, they begin to look at you differently. No longer as someone who forgives too easily, who can be manipulated, who comes back with just a few excuses, but as someone who can release with grace, walk away without hesitation, and remain silent with a presence that speaks louder than words. Not because you're cold, but because your heart is no longer ruled by those who aren't mature enough to honor it. They begin to miss you not because you tried to make them regret, but because you no longer need to be remembered. They begin to respect you not because you lashed out, but because you no longer react. And they begin to feel your absence not because you threatened to leave, but because you truly did, peacefully and with resolve. According to Stoic philosophy, the highest form of freedom doesn't come from being acknowledged by others, it comes from releasing the need for that acknowledgement entirely. When you're no longer influenced by praise, criticism, or the gaze of others, you become centered. And that grounded energy makes you more powerful than any plea ever could. You no longer need them to understand because you understand yourself. You no longer need their apology because you're no longer hurting. And you no longer need them to respect you because you've already learned to respect yourself fully. That's when true respect begins to take shape, not because you forced it, but because they're now faced with a choice: either adjust how they treat you, or lose someone who no longer needs them to stay. So don't confuse kindness with weakness. Don't expect patience to always be rewarded. Remember this: respect never comes from tears or begging. It comes from the boundaries you uphold, the doors you dare to close, and the dignity you never compromise. And in the end, the irony is, the less you need them to respect you, the more they're compelled to. Not because you made them afraid of losing you, but because you showed them you're no longer someone they can keep through unfairness.